Hello learners, welcome to today's online class. Today I'm going to talk about the growth of Canadian poetry, and this is from the course MEG 12. And today I'm going to talk about two particular relevant issues, the growth of Canadian poetry in the era of early and mid 20th century. That number one. Number two, I'll talk about the development of Canadian poetry in the 20th century's first half, which will be from 1900 to 1950. So when I'm talking about like main objectives of today's lecture, so the main objective of today's lecture is to introduce you to the general directions taken by Canadian poetry in the last 70 to 80 years, I would say. I mean, more than that, it could go for more than that. So let me give you, before I proceed on, just short background of how Canadian poetry came into origin, how it developed. See, the earliest words of poetry, the earliest works of poetry, mainly which were written by the visitors, described the new territories in optimistic terms, and they mainly targeted at the European audience, because at that time most of the visitors, they were from, you can say, European fields, European regions. So they had this European audience in their mind, and whenever they wrote keeping in mind the European audience. And one of the first works was Robert Hayman's Quodlibets, which was composed in Newfoundland and which was published in 1628. So that happens to be the first earliest work, which was written by Robert Hayman. Now, with the growth of English language communities near the end of the 18th century, now poetry, which was aimed at local, say, readers, began to appear in local newspapers, and those writings were mainly included to reflect the prevailing cultural values of the time. And these kinds of writings were modeled after English poetry of the same period. And if you look at the text, earliest texts which were published during that time, particularly in the 1900, early 19th century, I'm reminded of like Oliver Goldsmith's long poem, which was entitled The Rising Village, which appeared in 1825. And then it was a response to the Deserted Village, by his namesake and his great uncle Oliver Goldsmith. And in the first half of the 19th century, what we witness is that poetic works began to reflect local subjects. So writers were concerned about the local issues. They thought of, dealing with the local issues, which were concerning the people, because, they wanted to have the, appeal of the local people also, because earlier in the beginning, they had a European audience in their mind, but as they started living there, they had, local people in their mind, so local audience in their mind, so they started writing, keeping into perspective the local people and local issues as well. Now, when we talk about the other texts, like we have Acadia, which was published by Joseph Howe, and Saint Lawrence and Saguenay, so which was written by Charles Sangster. So these are the examples of this kind of trend where we witness the reflection of local subjects in these writings. And early nationalists, verses were composed by writers including Thomas D'Arcy and McKee. Many regional poets also espoused the British political and aesthetic jingoism of this period. For example, like High Tory loyalist and occasional poet Thomas H. Higginson, of like Bangkok, and so what he did was, he really produced like pains, to Sir Francis Bent and also the British war effort in the Crimea. That was kind of writing which was available for the people of that time, and while producing some interesting nature verse, and they produced, I mean, some of these nature verses which were quite appealing for the people. People found those verses very interesting to them, and these kinds of writings were also exemplifying the all-pervasive influence of also romantic poets such as Wordsworth's view of nature and the sublime. So we see the, I mean, clear influence of romantic poets also in the writings of Australian verses, Australian poetry. Now, so that was the background, I mean, in which we have to look at the growth of poetry. And just after that, these were the beginning, early ages of the growth of Canadian poetry. And thereafter, we witnessed the growth of Canadian poets. So, which I've already talked about in my first unit, Unit 1 and Unit 2 also. So now today, let me move on to this topic, which is to talk about the growth of poetry in terms of early and mid 20th century Canada. Okay. Now, in the early 20th century, a new group of poets appeared suddenly who took the responsibility of regrouping the elements of reality. So they looked at the reality and they thought of portraying all elements of reality into their writings. Okay, so they regrouped themselves and took the whole responsibility of portraying the elements of reality into their poetry. And in his book Paradise, Essays of Myth, Art and Reality, Louis Deduc, he states that Canadian poetry emerged out of inner necessity. So he's talking about this whole concept of inner necessity because it was required. Okay, it was required by the people. So innermost self of the poets also said that they must write about the reality of the time, and this book Paradise, okay, which is entitled Paradise, Essence of Myth, Art and Reality, is a proof, rather of a predicament than a solution of the great questions in this or any other time. So this is how Louis Dudek talks about Canadian poetry, okay, giving his own perspective about how it talked about the necessity, the rising necessity, inner necessity particularly. Then we have other poets also, other poets like G.D. Roberts, A.J.M. Smith and Earl Birney. All these poets, they took the responsibility of searching into the meaning of life in the Canadian environment. And their poetry reveals a special kind of cultural anxiety into their writing. So you will find the feel of cultural anxiety, okay, being present into their writings, which becomes a kind of a medium to handle the universal issues and cause issues as well. And their writings also encourage other poets of the generation to develop, okay, this kind of, poetry, this kind of sensibility also, particularly cultural anxiety of the time. And other poets were also influenced by that, and they did, they were influenced by in these kinds of poets, okay, who talked about cultural anxiety. Okay, now to have a proper understanding of Canadian poetry, it is very, very important to study very closely its nature poetry, because the role of nature poetry is immense when it comes to the discussion of Canadian poetry. When we look at the growth of Canadian poetry, we see that the role of nature poetry has gone immensely into it, which should not be mistaken for the poetry of natural landscape only. So when we talk about nature poetry, we do not have to necessarily relate it with natural landscape only. That no, when we talk about nature, it's dealing with extremely with landscape only, nothing as such. Okay, rather it stands for the exploration of land, map making, and naming of country, discovery of history. And therefore, consequently, a very different concept of the relation of relations is made, you can say, in the nature, okay, particularly where we see that nature appearing in poetry. Okay, so it's giving a different kind of a landscape description. So so it's giving us kind of a different kind of perception about poetry, particularly when we talk about the nature poetry. So therefore, it's very, very important to look at very closely to the nature poetry. Now, do the poets have sometimes, recognized the beauty, even lavishness of nature? They have not hesitated to project their, unexplained rejection of moss ground monsters, okay, which is a very common, phenomenon, a common concept which has been used again and again by Canadian poets, Canadian writers, where what we find is where, cruelty, particularly quote unquote cruelty, seems to be the law of nature. Okay, when they talk about moss ground monster, they do talk about the cruelty, okay, which happens to be the law of nature. And it appears that the poets have a split attitude, of acceptance and rejection both. And what we witness also is the fact that in Canada, as it is commonly known, okay, the only season is winter. So people just realize that the only winter which is available in Canada is winter, and its landscape is either deaf or actively hostile to man. And we also find that many people generalize it, spring is distributed here, okay, as even a poet Alden Nolan also stated in his poem, which was entitled April in New Brunswick, and what we also, sense there is that the fact that awfully destructive modes of nature are dominating. These modes of nature are dominating the long poems, even like we have Pratt's The Titanic, or even the Burney's David and Bush. These were the poems, okay, which were written by Pratt, and which really present another variety of death by nature. So we can see the impact of nature being described in the poetry format. So at times it's very devastating, at times it's very lovely landscape. So this is the kind of description which is being given to us by the nature poetry, which was there present in the Canadian poetry. And the attitude of the poets towards nature underwent a noticeable change later on. But it is the poets of the early decade of the 20th century who made the initial efforts to feel nature as a spiritual substance. Okay, so if you remember Wordsworth, Wordsworth is also attaching a lot of importance to nature. Okay, he's looking at nature as a soothing factor, soothing element. Okay, as a balm in times of pain. So we see that this kind of descriptions being given by nature poets. Okay, and the same thing is happening in terms of Canadian poets also. And we see that poets like A.G.M. Smith, and Archibald Lampman, they collectively seek the significance of life in the new environment. Okay, and they both, Smith as well as Lampman, okay, they played very significant role, talking about the significance of life in the new environment. And between 1910 and 1935, the poetic tradition and culture, both created by, say, pioneers, had undergone a lot of modifications. So that was the era, 1910 to 1935, which has witnessed a lot of transformation. Okay, a lot of transformation happening in the Canadian poetry. And even later on, the war, the war poetry, the war of 1914 and 1918, put a complete serious question mark on the political and economic security of the nation. And what we see is the fact that the depression of the 1930s and even the war of 1939 to 1945, Second World War, led to the complete collapse of the whole system of thought and belief. So they had adverse, Canadian poets also had very adverse impact of World War II in their writings as well. And poets like Dorothy Livesey, even E.J. Pratt, okay, they grew very anxious to cultivate a new poetic style, which could capture the new substance of life, and at the same time make a direct appeal to the readers. Okay, so they were quite conscious about the poetic style also, the kind of style they were engaging into their writings, and they were quite apt in selecting appropriate style, okay, in their writings as well. and their poetry is man-centered psychologically, even intellectually. Okay, the role of nature, the significance of poetic devices, okay, like imagery and symbols were also redefined. So we find these poets, you can say, making use of, several poetic devices. Okay, a lot of images, a lot of symbols are being used by these poets in the description of Canadian poetry. Talking about the current issues, engaging with the local issues and other issues as well. Now, though the earliest Canadian anthology of any importance was, okay, obviously importance was there of Canadian anthology, we find that E.H. Dwarf, okay, writing a selection from Canadian poets, okay, a book, you can say, anthology, which was published in 1864. So in terms of anthology, there were two important books. This is the first one, which was, obviously written by E.H. Dwarf. So it was he who really came up with this anthology selection from Canadian poets, okay, which was published in 1864. There was another anthology which came up, okay, market, which was compiled by A.J.M. Smith, and in the name of the book was The Book of Canadian Poetry, which appeared in 1943. So these both anthologies, one is the selection from Canadian poets, which was written by E.H. Dwarf, and the other one, which was entitled The Book of Canadian Poetry, okay, written by A.J.M. Smith. Both these anthologies presented the changes of taste and quality in poetry written between 1948 and 1957. Okay, so those both anthologies became very, very popular at that time. And then we also witnessed many subsequent anthologies, okay, like Smith's Oxford Book of Canadian Verse, okay, which was published in 1960. There is another important anthology which was published in 1967, which was entitled Modern Canadian Verse, okay, which included the representative works in both English as well as French language. So to understand Canadian poetry of the mid-20th century, one of the fundamental approaches is to look at a historical and insightful critical process, which A.J.M. Smith and E.K. Brown both, encouraged, a lot, And this kind of, writings, okay, this kind of writing helped in and the growth of development of poetry in two ways, It also established a canon of Canadian poetry and assessed the achievements of individual poets, and it also opened up vistas for endless possibilities of having Canadian criticism with its own traditions and visions of Canadian poetry, which means that a poetry appropriate to Canadian experience, to use the works of George Woodcock, and if the poetry of the early decades, particularly, for example, say of Charles Sangster, or E.J. Pratt, or even Archibald Lambman, Charles G.D. Roberts, D.C. Scott, and Isabel Valency Crawford, okay, all these, it makes, their writing, makes a very special use of Canadian sense and the world of nature. It's very, very important. If you look at the thematic considerations, the kind of, topics, they are engaging with, you'll find that they are making use of Canadian scenes, even the world of nature. They're dealing with world of nature also. And the poetry of later decades has added a peculiar quality of imagism, or you can say, obviously they make use of imaginations, okay, and they also made use of several poetic devices, also imagery, symbols, okay, which is visual, also translates the landscape into words. So you find as if the whole landscape of Canada is described in the words by these poets, and various traditions of early English poetry, like that of T.E. Helms or English Jacobeans, and even Jewish tradition, okay, they commingled and created extraordinary effects, as in the poetry of A.M. Klein, okay, as we witness, okay. And moreover, we also see that there exists in Canadian poetry a new sense of sharing the vision, either sharing the vision or even voices at the global level without losing the intensity of the personal vision about the immediate world. So we see, how the voices at the global level also, has been described by this Canadian poet or Canadian poetry particularly, and another characteristic quality of Canadian poetry is that it attempts to assimilate and at the same time rebel against the conventional poets. And an effort was also made that gave Canadian poets an idiom, okay, that perfectly suited their private visions as well as the moods of the period. On the contrary, if you look at this kind of poetry, Canadian poetry, what we find is that they were distinctly different voices. Okay, we find a lot of distinct voices, okay, emerging during that time, and there were not only different voices, but also there were interlocked groups. There were also interlocked groups, okay, which could be seen at that time, who shared the common predicament, common sense of promoting cultural nationalism through poetry, okay, and in an attempt to find their own voices self-consciously, they happened to discover their collective national identity through poetry. So poetry became an important agency through which they could talk about the national identity or the national identity. Okay, so briefly, the poets realized that if they gave expression to the experiences they knew within their own place and time, they may emerge as distinctively Canadian poets. Therefore, they talk and they started incorporating, expressions, okay, which were based on experiences, okay, and also within their own place and time. And they focused on incorporating certain kinds of national elements also into their writings, and their social conventional rhythm and sharp visual images which were incorporated by them added a new dimension to their poetry. So this is a unique experience which we witness, which we see in Canadian poetry, how they are making use of conversational rhythm, they're making use of sharp visual images also to make a kind of to create a new dimension to their poetry. For example, like for illustration, take the works of Dorothy Livesey, whose intense feminism and personal experiences combined with political concerns make her a truly liberated and vigorous poet. So that's how we look at Dorothy. Similarly, in P.K. Page's poetry also there is remarkable verbal economy and intensity which we witness. And poets like Irving Layton and Miriam Waddington, even Margaret, Avison, they reveal a world of perception rich in perplexities of faith and doubt. Now, so this was about how we look at the poets of the early and mid 20th century Canadian poetry. Now let me move on to the discussion of the last, okay, to this last, you can say, period which I am dealing with, which is the 20th century's first half. Okay, so which will deal with 1900 to 1950. Okay, and this half will serve as a context for the second half also. In the next class I'll be talking about the second half, contemporary poetry, so where we will see the impact of the poets of the first half also. And in this half, the romantic and Victorian heritage dominated the scene. So what we witness, okay, is that in the first half of the 20th century, we see the romantic and Victorian elements are being reflected upon in the writings, and there was a phase of neo-colonial modernism which we witnessed in this one. And also among the transitional figures was, you can say, E.J. Pratt, okay, and then come followers of Anglo-American free versists also and imagists. And here W.W.E. Ross was also very notable figure in the early 20th century. And then came finally the Montreal group, okay, the Montreal group, which was regarded as a new kind of a group. So so what we witness today, what we have talked about today, is that we have looked at the development of Canadian poetry, Okay, while talking about it, I told you that when we look at the Canadian poetry from, like, I mean, category point of view, you can divide into three parts. Like, you can talk about the beginning of literary poetry, Canadian poetry, and then Confederation poetry. So you talk about, like, you can put the whole Canadian poetry into three categories. One is the beginning part of the Canadian poetry, okay, and the second is the Confederation poets, and then thirdly contemporary poetry. So I've talked about the first two parts, the beginning part and the early 20th century poets. In the next class, we will look at the contemporary poetry, and we'll see what are the important features of Canadian poetry. Okay, so I hope that today's lecture has helped you in understanding about the growth of Canadian poetry in terms of the beginning part and also in terms of the early 20th century poetry. So that's it for today. Thank you so much.